Hi, everyone. This is Scarlett Johnson here on Unleashed. I just heard my dog barking for a second. Presented by Moms for Liberty. And I'm here with special guest Jan Jekielek. And I've really been practicing pronouncing your name so I say it right. So I hope I did. I'm so happy to be here with you. I'm a huge fan. I watch American thought leaders all the time. Your conversation with Aaron, a friend of mine from California, was riveting. It was so good. And I thank you for platforming so many parents, so many important stories. I've been watching you since COVID, and you guys always had the most groundbreaking stories, and at epic times always told the truth. And I really appreciated that. So thank you for joining me today on my show.
Scarlett, I'm thrilled to be here. And of course, Moms for Liberty has been an incredible organization, on a number of issues. I think your dog now has quieted down, but I thought that he or she was kind of jealous of not being able to be in the shot. And by the way, I did this interview with Kyle Bass at one point during COVID, right? And so he's, at home, he's got this really nice setup, and there's this staircase on the side that you can see. And the reason this video went viral, I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, right, is because this little doggy comes down the stairs, right, in the middle of like some, a very important point about the Chinese economy being made, and people loved it. So you can always, don't be afraid to bring the dog in the frame,
Oh yeah, Gigi is really pretty too. She just, she's a barker if she hears any noises or someone walking past. So she's a great guard dog. She'll bark. But the secret is if you pet her, she loves you. And so she's not really killer dog, but she barks pretty heavily. So we love her. Anyway, so you're on today to talk about your new book that is going to be released very soon, March 17th, I believe. And it's a really important book. And I'm going to just bring it up really fast to show everyone. Killed to Order. And this is to discuss China's organ harvesting industry, the true nature of America's biggest adversary. What is important about this story is first of all, it's really horrendous what's happening and the violations of human rights. But it's the understanding of the CCP and their moral philosophies that underpin their government. And that I think a lot of Americans don't fully appreciate and understand who we're dealing with when we're dealing with China. And I think you shed a lot of light on that.
Scarlett, thank you. And I appreciate that, because something like 2/3 of the book is really about trying to understand, trying to explain how that system actually works under the Chinese Communist Party, and using this forced organ harvesting, this killed to order industry as a kind of a lens to understand that. If I may, I can just explain very briefly like how this is different than your, let's call it a run-of-the-mill black market organ trade, which is horrific in itself, because I think it'll kind of illustrate the connection to moral philosophy will become very clear in a moment. But basically, we're talking about a situation where you need someone who can push massive coercive power in through a system, like a state actor, right? i.e. the Chinese Communist Party. And there's another element. You have to be able to push mass propaganda into the system and basically dehumanize a sizable group of people. And I'll explain why in a moment. And then you also have to be able to incarcerate a large group of people. You have to have a large security apparatus to do that, like say 1 million or 2 million. And this is what the Chinese Communist Party did back in 1999 with Falun Gong practitioners. It was a very popular spiritual discipline, very bottom-up, very grassroots, very different from communism, which is kind of obscenely hierarchical. And the dictator at the time basically decided that he's going to get rid of it, right? And that didn't mean, by the way, that you're going to kill everybody. It meant that in these types of systems, they have apparatuses that basically re-educate, there's horrible words for it, re-educate, transform, basically coerce people out of the thing they believe, whether they're pro-democracy activists or religious believers or Falun Gong practitioners or whatever. So suddenly 70 to 100 million people were made illegal in China. And that's why the propaganda comes in, because they had to be, you had to convince the rest of the population that 1 in 13 Chinese was doing something evil and horrible and should be, you know, seen as dangerous or problematic, right? And so once that happened, and it turned out that the Falun Gong practitioners proved uniquely resilient to this forced, coercive, basically, you know, re-education system that was imposed on them. They started basically being murdered in these labor camps and prison systems because there was an unwritten rule that Falun Gong deaths will be considered suicides. But you kind of needed to have that dehumanization part because most people aren't ready to harm their fellow man too easily. They kind of have to, they play a trick. This propaganda plays a trick on our mind, and it allows us to do things that we wouldn't normally do because the person is somehow lesser, somehow worse. Then they incarcerated 1 million, right? Or so. Then they started blood typing, tissue typing, organ matching them. Okay. And then now you had ads, even in the West, that basically said for some amount of money, maybe 100, 200 grand, you can get a new heart in 2 weeks scheduled. And that the only way that can happen is because this person, incarcerated person, now a prisoner of conscience, is pre-matched to you because of that database information that is kind of, they're basically warehoused, ready to be killed to order on demand once you pay that cash. That is the Chinese transplant system.
Wow, that's really shocking. And I've heard of the Uyghurs. We've heard of some of the human rights abuses there. This is a story I have not heard before. How did this?
And so just to your point, Scarlett, to your point, okay, for about 14 or 15 years, the Falun Gong were the prime, basically, you know, fodder for this horrible transplant industry. But I argue that because no one really did anything about it, even there were some international organizations that effectively ran cover for it, just sort of legitimizing, they're suggesting that the Chinese transplant trade was reforming when in fact it wasn't. In 2014 or 2015, the Uyghurs were added. They dehumanized another large group of people. The Uyghurs are in the northwest of China. It's a much smaller population, about 12, 14 million people. Very easy to incarcerate because the area is under military control and they look different, right? So very easy to dehumanize, and then also very easy to incarcerate, which they did, again, 1 million plus people. And they just added them as the next group that would be used for this, right? So this is this Niemöller poem, right, idea, right? First they came for the Jews, but I wasn't a Jew, and it kind of goes down the line. And I'm actually worried right now that there will be other groups added to this, you know, monstrous machine, because I am seeing, for example, increased dehumanizing language against Christians as the Christian, anti-Christian persecution in China is ramping up, with the Zion Church being rolled up, and also, you know, Catholic clergy being, you know, put under control, stricter controls, and so forth.
Why would any international organizations, even Western organizations, basically cover this up? Why won't they talk about it?
I think there's a few reasons, okay? That is an excellent question, right? And because I could sort of tackle it from different places. The first one is, it's just unbelievable. And this is something I faced when I first encountered this, the allegations. We have a revulsion against it. We just don't want it to be true. We don't, and it actually, you know, it also, there's a sort of a certain aspect of accountability when you realize something this monstrous is true. It's like you feel like you might have to do something, and that is, you know, and we're all very busy. You know, this same thing actually happened during the Holocaust. I remember there was Jan Karski, very famous Polish young nobleman. He traveled to the U.S., spoke literally with the AG, right? Felix Frankfurter back in the day, a Jew, by the way. And there's this famous line that Frankfurter says later, after the fact. He says, it's not that I thought this young man was lying, it's that I was unable to believe him. And people kind of interpret this line in different ways, but it's, again, same concept. So it starts with that, right? But then there's also when people, so something that I highlight in the book a lot is complicity. So because I have a whole chapter on how the Chinese Communist Party functions to make both its internal population and people outside, like sort of partners, or complicit in various ways, to make it harder to kind of disentangle yourself from the whole web of activity. So for example, you can have an international transplant association, right, which has somehow become invested. Maybe they have financial relationships. I don't know. I'm giving an example that then has to make some decisions, like how deeply do I look into this?
Yes.
In the early days, I was convinced by 2006 that it was real, but there wasn't like evidence of the sort where someone walks in on a or operation happening, right? This is all done under state secrecy. People are executed if they, kind of whistle blow or I say anything about it, right? It's a state secret. So it's very hard to get that kind of direct evidence. And also another side of you, once you have that kind of close relationship, what you're told by the CCP people is, look, we're trying to reform this. I know there's this bad system and there's these bad guys that are doing stuff, but we're working to try to change that. Can you help us? Can you work with us? Right. And then that state just lasts for 20 years, right? This is actually part of their strategy. They always sort of appeal to our better sides, right? On the one side, but also, with the knowledge that disentangling or creating a problem actually comes with a lot of cost. So there's kind of a carrot and stick type of activity all the time. So on the one hand, we don't want to believe it. On the other hand, the CCP has a very pernicious approach to keeping people kind of, embroiled with it and engaged with it, both internally and externally.
They have a very sophisticated propaganda machine that they use on their own people. And I think they use in the West, maybe also keep us distracted and fighting each other so that we're not analyzing what's happening too close, I would think. What is the hard evidence about this practice? How is that kind of broken through after all of this time?
So there's a few pieces of evidence I can kind of lead you towards, but the actual body of evidence is massive. There's a China tribunal was held between late 2018 and early 2020, where Sir Jeffrey Nice, who prosecuted Slobodan Milosevic, convened a people's tribunal, international people's tribunal, got a number of independent experts who then assessed the whole body of evidence. And there's different types. Like, for example, there's a film crew that goes to China and pretends to want a transplant, okay, and talks to people and gets shocking information. There's people calling hospitals saying, hey, do you've got organs? How quickly can I get them? 2 weeks? Perfect, right? There's all sorts of evidence of that nature, okay? Then there's like one of the sort of a very solid piece of evidence, which I'd like to point you towards, is a paper in the American Journal of Transplantation a few years back called Execution by Organ Procurement. That's the title of the paper. They looked at the Chinese transplant literature, the published peer-reviewed Chinese transplant literature, okay? And they looked at the methods and they asked the question, is the dead donor rule ever being violated in these methods, right? And they found at least 70 papers out of between 2,000 and 3,000 where it was very clear in the methods that the dead donor rule was violated. They wrote it into the methods. And what that means is that the way the person died, or multiple people in the studies that were being referenced, the organ removal was the way of death, right? In other words, the person was murdered by having their organs removed, right? So, and it's so, the way I read that is it's so commonplace there. It's happening at such a scale. And frankly, everybody in the system is involved in it, that they forget that this is not something you can admit to publicly in your published literature, which they published, right? So that would be another piece. Another piece of evidence is there's a survivor. Amazingly, there's a survivor, right? I never thought we'd ever see him, but this is a man who's missing part of his liver and part of his lung, and he somehow near miraculously lived to tell the tale. But he exists, and they admit to having operated on him against his will, amazingly as well, because they never admit to anything. In this case, it was almost like they wanted to say too much. They inadvertently made that admission. But so the body of evidence is very broad and extensive, but I'm just giving you a few examples.
And so I have so many questions. One, I have a family history of family members in medicine, a son who just graduated from medical school, daughter graduating from nursing school, another daughter that's interested in medical school. And the violation of, I know maybe they're in America, we have the Hippocratic Oath, but I would assume that when you become a doctor, when you become a nurse, your goal is to heal people. And it's hard for me to imagine that there are people in China that, as doctors, that they are willing to do this, and what has happened to them that they have accepted this practice and that they are willing to do this. And the other question is that I'm old enough to remember when even the left, especially maybe the left, cared about human rights violations, and world organizations were formed after World War II and after the atrocities of the Holocaust to make sure that this never happened again. And yet these organizations are often defending China and refuse to talk about the evil that is communism and CCP. Instead, they run cover for them, and they even revere Mao. It's kind of shocking to me what's happened.
Well, the most effective weapon, right, that every communist regime in history has wielded, in my opinion, starting with the Bolsheviks, is propaganda. And and Mao, Lenin, prior to the revolution, right, prior to the Bolsheviks winning in what became the Soviet Union and Russia, right, Marx was basically it was unknown, right? His economic theories had been completely discredited by his contemporaries, and from what I know, he died with like 2 people at his funeral, if that. Like, he was just an unknown person. The Bolsheviks, once they won under Lenin, created the grand myth that this communist manifesto, that this Das Kapital, right, that there's an incredible theory, and they finally realized that people are oppressed and they can struggle. And anyway, it was a mythology created to justify the atrocity that happened when the Bolsheviks took power and onwards, right? And there were probably a number of leftist, these kind of collectivist leftist philosophers which could have been picked, but they picked Marx for whatever reason. Maybe it's because it was the most compelling. I don't know. I still look, my book right now is a number one bestseller in Communism and Socialism. It's still in pre-order, by the way, and I'd encourage you to go to killtoorder.com to get it if I'm shamelessly going to plug it here.
Yes.
But right now it's the number one bestseller today as we speak in Communism and Socialism. But it keeps fighting on that list because I check, all the time with the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. Like, people are buying this in huge numbers. And I do think we should study these things because we need to understand like what we're dealing with. But it's also wildly popular, and especially among young people, they've been taught that this is sort of a legitimate philosophy, right? That this is that it has intellectual value. It does not, right? It's a sham. And of course, we could talk about how it is that way too, but that's perhaps for a different discussion. But it always leads to atrocity. It always leads to atrocity, and I explain why in the book, actually, in quite detail.
I guess a little bit, tantalize a little bit. Why does it always lead to atrocity, and is that connected to the underlying philosophy that allows this atrocity to happen, which is utilitarian philosophy, very, very unlike the philosophy that our founders, that our country was built upon the human dignity, on human rights, the absolute primacy of a human being and the human soul. And obviously, that is not the same with the CCP.
No, absolutely, and you're hitting the nail on the head, right? So if you look at, say, let's take medicine, right? We can have a kind of a range of approaches. Okay, on one end we have, pure Hippocratic medicine, which is, I'm a medical practitioner. I'm looking at you. I'm thinking to myself, I need to understand the nuance of your being, of your past history, of your problems, of your personality, all of this, and I'm going to try to give if I need to give an intervention at all, I try to give one that will have the least amount of harm to you potentially, right? That's where this do no harm idea comes in. That's Hippocratic medicine. And then the system is basically, it's a collection of all these medical practitioners working that way, right? Trying to do the best for their absolute best for their patients in their unique situation. Okay. And then this, when Christianity came, kind of on the scene, it was a very natural Hippocratic medicine, a very, very natural approach for Christianity, where there's this inherent, dignity of every individual, as you mentioned. The other side of this, okay, is a collectivist approach. It's what you call utilitarian bioethics. Okay. And utilitarian bioethics is basically the greatest good for the greatest number. Some people describe it as the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So basically what that means, let's take the most benevolent sort of way to describe it would be, we have this large population, and if it could really help the vast majority, and we would need to sacrifice a very small number, that would be okay. Okay, because it will be the greatest good for most people, right? So for example, if there's a medicine that has a very, very rare side effect, but it would save a whole bunch of people's lives, but this rare side effect would result in deaths, you would say, okay, well, it's okay we justify that because so it'll save so many other people's lives. So the problem with utilitarian bioethics, this approach, right, is that in the end, it can become very arbitrary what this greatest good is. Okay. And so, and I actually realized in the process of writing this book, and I started thinking a lot about this during the COVID years, okay, about these kinds of questions.
Yes.
Is there's this famous line from Stalin where he says, in order to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. Okay. And what does that mean? Right. Well, it means that it's justified to have some death in order to achieve the revolution, right? In order to achieve the utopia that comes at the end of revolution. The problem since Lenin in every communist society, right? The pinnacle of the greatest good is the survival and supremacy of the Communist Party. They're very transparent about this, right? And so if you understand that, and no amount of and it's an atheist system, human beings from the philosophical perspective don't have any particular inherent value, right? They're just sort of parts of a system of this kind of some future utopia which you never get to. It's a revolutionary system, right? So now you can imagine, right? What happens, because why wouldn't you have atrocity? Because, well, communist systems frankly don't work. They're parasitic, right? And a big reason the Chinese Communist Party is still around today, perhaps the only major reason at this point, is that it's heavily parasitic on the US and other Western economies, which actually, create real wealth, right? Create prosperity, increase the size of the pie. So the communist mentality is a zero-sum mentality. Okay. In fact, what they tell people is this is how you would actually achieve revolution. This is how you convince what Lenin called the useful idiots, right? To revolt, because they say, look, the reason that these rich people have stuff and you don't have stuff is because they took it from you.
Yep.
Because they say that the pie is fixed. This is kind of this is how it is in the animal kingdom. This is what we were, as a biologist back in the day. Of course, we're taught this way. You have to, someone is getting the resources and someone else isn't. But the thing with humanity, right? Where does prosperity come from? Well, prosperity comes from innovation. It comes from division of labor. There's been great treatises written all trying to understand where prosperity comes from. Like the reason you work for someone, right, is because you're actually better off working. They're better off maybe more than you are, but you're also better off working for them instead of trying to figure it all out yourself, right? Hence the division of labor idea. So, but you're not, the communists, they forget about all that. And they just say they're taking your stuff, so you should revolt against them. Okay, and so this zero-sum mentality, just to finish the thought, I know I can see you're jumping. You want to jump in. I don't want to stop you, but it always leads to atrocity because the system doesn't work very well. The Communist Party must always be right according to the propaganda, right? And it must always survive at any cost. And the cost of that has been hundreds of millions of lives, or tens of millions of lives if not a few hundred million lives over the years.
Yes. And so, because I think the question that goes through my mind is, how is this system surviving when it commits these atrocities against its people? And I think what you said, America plays a part in that, because they are able to buff up their economy. They sell everything to us. They have taken over. I mean, when you have 80% of our life-saving or necessary drugs made in China, that we import those, and so many other things, then there's this relationship where we need them. And I know that President Trump is trying to lessen that. But is that part of, are we complicit as America? Are we complicit in their survival?
We're complicit in many ways, but as I have a whole chapter dedicated to this, explaining how the Chinese Communist Party functions to create this complicity. So it's of course, we have a lot of responsibility here, but it's also important to note that system functions to create that complicity. It's a feature, not a bug. Okay, sort of thing of how they operate. And just I can sort of describe to you some of these methods, right, of creating complicity. But like one of them would be just something simple, right, where you're asked to, you're in China and someone says, "Comrade, can you please tell me what your husband was up to last night?" Right, and you're like, "Well, I don't really want to tell you, because it's just not, I don't like telling on my husband to the government," right? Well, okay, so the person like, "Well, okay, but your daughter is actually in school right now, and my coworker is with her right now, and we wouldn't want anything to happen to her. Are you sure you don't want to tell me what your husband was doing?" Right? And of course, what you do is you tell, right? Because it's the lesser, you want to protect your daughter, but you kind of sacrifice your husband. And now that you've done this, okay? And so there's this mass complicity creation this way, this type of, this is just one example of how this is done, but there's millions of ways they do this again and again and again to the entire population. And it's a very unusual, rare person that can resist it entirely, because you're always just given these, you have to choose the lesser of two evils, right? Scenarios. That's just one example internally. Externally, there's also the financial involvement, right? The moment you create deep financial ties, and they started doing this, right? You remember Scrowcroft we learned, later that after the Tiananmen Square massacre, which was a massive massacre, at least 5,000 students were massacred by the People's Liberation Army. Scrowcroft goes to China and basically says, "Look, we're going to ride this out. Don't worry," right? Now, why would they? That's crazy. They just this group just massacred a whole, the students looking for democracy, everything that America stands for. The whole mantra was, "We're going to change you," right? America was supposed to change China, make it more democratic, liberalized, and everything, right? But here we sent our own, envoy to say, "Hey, look, it's going to be okay. We'll work, we'll ride this out. Don't freak out. We're gonna try to keep relationships good." Well, because we had already developed a whole bunch of very important people in America had developed some very close financial ties, and we didn't want to have problems, right? And you rationalize that to yourself all sorts of ways. Part of it is because you're making the money and you don't want to have the cash stop flowing. And part of it, you say, well, it'll hurt the economy and we wouldn't want that. And partially, there's an election coming and we wouldn't want to mess with that. You can see how this goes, right? And suddenly we've created complicity. And this has been going, for many, many, many decades. And we even believed back then, when I started at Epoch, right? 95%, I don't know if that might be a little bit over, but some massive amount of people believed in the year 2000, or I started in 2005, so even as late as 2005, that China was liberalizing through US intervention, right? And we were like, no, they're killing people for refusing to give up their faith. Like, that's not a liberalizing society. This is happening at scale, right? But everyone believed it, left, right, Republican, Democrat. It was wild, right?
it was sort of, I think, a deal with the devil, and the belief that we are going to influence them and they aren't going to influence us. That we, by working with them, they are going to be liberalized. They are going to start to value human life. That they're going to generate wealth, and then the people are going to want that. They're going to want to be a part of that economy, and they're going to develop a middle class, and boom, they're going to be more like us. And I think what's turning out is we have become more like them, unfortunately. That this has not been a good deal, and that they have found a way to influence our population, our youth, education. Particularly, we discussed before we went on air, my concern that in America, our young kids are not, they don't learn about Chinese Communist government. They don't learn about the CCP. They're too busy being taught that to be MAGA is to basically be a Nazi or something like that. They learn all about certain atrocities without learning about communist atrocities. And I know in Florida, Governor DeSantis is working really hard to rectify that by different requirements for teachers, offering grants if teachers learn more about American philosophy and the underpinnings of our Republican democracy, and then also requiring courses on communism, which I fully approve. But I think that our kids don't understand communism. Their teachers, more often than not, actually praise China. They basically side with China against America, and they view us as the oppressors and Chinese as liberators. And it's just shocking to me.
That's astonishing. I would love to learn more about that. I mean, I know that in Confucius, the Chinese had one of the chapters in my book is about the United Front work department, which is kind of, you can think of it like a ministry or a department in China, one of the largest. I think it's maybe the second largest after state security. It has, the last I checked, but this was many years ago, was a $40 billion budget. It's probably a lot larger now. Its whole purpose is to influence people to bring people alongside on the Chinese Communist Party's end. So one of their big initiatives was what are called Confucius Institutes. So they would pay American universities a lot of cash to provide materials about how to teach Chinese and everything. And of course, all those materials didn't talk about Tiananmen Square. Anything that would sort of make the regime look bad was excluded. And by the way, again, talk about this complicity thing, right? Everybody would know that it would be very gauche to say something against this regime that's funding, our education in Chinese, right? So we were not going to do that. We don't want to rock the boat, right? Whereas this is like some of the most important information, right, that people need to learn, right? But they're not learning it. But what you described in terms of our own teachers actually thinking like that, I don't know of actual instances of that. If that is true, it's horrible. Like I can't even. You're even kind of, going past what I was ready to accept. Like who would be sort of saying that the Chinese are the liberators? I mean, really?
Yes.
Even after seeing the welding of people into their homes during COVID, or like, is that how are they liberators? I don't.
Che Guevara posters in their classrooms.
Unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. Nikki Neely in Defending Ed has talked a lot about those Confucius institutes and universities. And I would say there's certain areas of this country, and I think what happens in California never stays there. California, Oregon, Washington State.
Because it's one thing, Scarlett, it's one thing to, there's this kind of what you would call American Marxist or Marxian, this kind of woke, ideology, right? But that's not necessarily the same as saying, yeah, communist China, go, it's the best. But
the number one required material in the schools of education, I just talked to Daniel Buck about this, is Paulo Freire. And Paulo Freire, Mao praised his work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It is still the number one most cited book in schools of education. and in their papers as they go on to their master's degree in philosophy. And this sort of open, it's like soft Marxism, cultural Marxism is relevant. It's all throughout these
100%.
schools of education, and they will take, like, they would rather see China win in the Olympics than America. And it's just shocking.
Oh, okay, I see. Because it breeds this anti-Americans. They imagine they're struggling against this oppressive American system.
Yes.
I get it. I gotcha. So, like, you're teaching me here a little bit. I mean, I should add this to my to my stick here as I talk about. No, but it's horrible. And of course, but this is a lot of people. It's very interesting. I come across a lot of people lately who are basically saying, like, for example, right now there's a war in Iran, people saying, hey, why are we looking over there? We've got these massive problems internally, right? But so the Chinese communist regime, as you've been pointing out, right, has put a ton of effort, okay, into subverting us, and continues to, massive multi-billion-dollar operations. And it's like they're experts at it, right? And their utilitarian view, by the way, just on this utilitarian side, right? Iran for China, they view it in a utilitarian fashion. It's been an incredibly useful tool. They buy 90% of this illicit oil that gets past embargoes through the shadow fleet, right? And they have a distraction where the US keeps having to look at terror in the Middle East, this huge destabilizations out there. And meanwhile, China under the CCP is growing and continuing its just egregious behavior, economic warfare, whatever, you name it, basically dumping and cornering all these markets, like, medicines, I think you talked about a little bit earlier as an example of that, but, rare earths, whatever. Yeah. So they're very, this whole utilitarian view, they're ready to kind of use and throw away whoever it is. It's very interesting that they're not actually, really stepping up to help their so-called ally Iran at all.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's complicated. And what you've said, we have mutual friend, James Lindsay, has talked about, he's been ridiculed for it, and he's been proven to be right, talking about the influence of bots, buying off influencers and spreading seeds of disinformation and trying to cause rifts on the right, on the left. To them, chaos is a ladder. They just want
100%. And by the way, that's their expertise is infiltrating movements, right? Like, almost, they've worked very hard to subvert every kind of freedom-oriented group in China, right? Whether it's, the Tibetan movement suffered greatly after during the 2008 Olympics. They basically went and they put this massive banner, Free Tibet, off of a bridge, right? And after that, the CCP just dedicated massive resources into destroying that movement. And they would subvert, like, there were people, there were police officers, Tibetan police officers that were found in New York, for example, to be agents of the regime and so forth. So it's like this is their expertise, is to kind of go in, infiltrate, coerce. Sometimes, people do it, they don't have a choice, because they have a child that's been, or a loved one who is being, leveraged to get them to do the thing, right? They have this, it's so important, right? They really have no boundary as to what terrible thing they will do to achieve their goal, which is, again, that supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party in the top position, maintaining power at any cost.
I think that is something that needs to be disseminated to American children in schools and in colleges, because so much of what we do, it's tied to China. And if they understood their philosophy and understood the atrocities, and they did have to learn about the hundreds of millions of souls that have been lost to communism, and that it's not cool to wear the Che Guevara. It's not cool to the fist in the air communists. Like, this is deadly, and it hurts people at the end. If they had more of an understanding of that, I think that things would be different in our country. But getting back to your book, what are American, yes, your book, Killed to Order, what can American medical institutions and physicians group, what can they do to make sure that this atrocity does not come into our medicine, or has it already infiltrated? Are we already, like you said, that there are Western people that are inquiring about these organs? Has that already infiltrated into American medicine? And how could we fight back?
It's a huge question, okay? But in the very sort of most basic way, for example, we train Chinese transplant surgeons. We shouldn't do that. We have research partnerships with Chinese universities. We fund research in Chinese universities that are involved in transplantation. And over there, to the best of our knowledge, there really isn't a lot of attempts even at creating a legitimate organ registry, because again, you have this massive machine bureaucracy that's been created now for decades that's functioning and delivering, right? So there isn't a lot of incentive for that to happen, even though they pretend with what was shown. You know, by the way, another piece of evidence is they pretended to create a donor registry in 2015, but researchers showed that the data they provided was a perfect quadratic equation. In other words, they falsified the data in a not particularly elegant way, okay? Like it's very obviously fake, right? It goes on and on. So the least we can do, I think, is just say, look, we're not going to participate in this. We're not going to sell you the technologies to do that, or the materials or the solutions or any of that. We're not going to train your surgeons. We're not going to fund anything remotely related to a transplant industry in China. That is the easiest thing we can do.
Yeah.
Right. But also what we can do is there's actually two pieces of legislation in Congress right now that have passed the House near unanimously. One is called the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. One of the provisions of that is it just says we should cut off all ties with transplantation in China. Another one is we should sanction for life anyone who is involved in that. Okay. And the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act, a broader act around organ harvesting with a bit of a focus on China, but also on organ trafficking and others. Both excellent pieces of legislation. They should pass the Senate. We should put effort into seeing them pass. I think if they just get out of committee and are, basically brought to the floor, I don't think too many people are voting against this.
Yes.
Pretty straight up. There have been resolutions in the past where Congress has basically said, this is real. Like we've already, the American legislative system has said, we believe this is real. Now's the time to put some teeth in that, against that. There's 6 states that have passed legislation to stop just insurance or Medicare or Medicaid for paying for any China transplants. That's a no-brainer legislation. Another 44 states to go. People can, get involved in getting those laws passed. Again, I have it all. I put it. It's all in here. I actually have an appendix dedicated to this question of all at the grassroots level for individual people, at the state, at the federal level, everywhere.
I appreciate that, because at the grassroots level where I operate, this should be a bipartisan no-brainer that we could start in my home state of Wisconsin and any other of the states that do not already have this legislation. Get it on the books in your state. This is a bipartisan issue. I think that the Democrats, Republicans can unite on this, and the legislation, we could put some pressure, we could write, we could post about it and get this out of committee, get it into the Senate, get it passed. I have no doubt that President Trump would sign such legislation, and then to continue to advocate through now the Trump administration and in any, like the ending and any kind of federal funding that is provided to medical institutions that are training these Chinese surgeons or providing technology to them if they are engaging in this practice. And, I think it's you can't trust a communist government to give you the good statistics. And I just think that we cut off ties. We don't train these surgeons. We don't fund what's happening. This is an abomination.
And I would argue, try to do it as loudly as possible, because the thing is, this is one of these things, if people are aware it's real, right, it changes. Like at scale, I'm talking about at scale, because even in China, most people, they know it as a rumor. Some people believe it, some people don't. I mean, it's the people that are used for it are all dehumanized dissidents, right? Who no one wants to become, because there's always someone that's persecuted by the regime, and most people are just trying to avoid get in the crosshairs, right? There's a whole social credit system, to kind of dedicated to assessing how regime friendly you are now there as well, like, sort of draconian thing.
Yes.
But yeah, no, like I love everything you're saying. I mean, it's not even that difficult to do. It's just a matter of, this is actually, so the reason I'm kind of brandishing this book around, I actually think, like, if we can get this to be a bestseller, that's why I'm trying to get people killtoorder.com. That's the Amazon link. It's actually #1 in communism and socialism and in Asian politics today. It's like #10 in all politics or something like that. And it's going to come out March 17th. If we can make it big, right, I just think it will spread the word sufficiently that this is actually something where a people's movement makes a huge difference. Yeah. Because no one can really say this is okay. Like, it's not a partisan issue of any sort. Everyone is like, this is bad. Everyone can get behind the idea that this is bad. Like, nobody wants this.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's what it's not partisan. It's something that you can work with your state legislature with, and you can go to Democrats, Republicans, and I think they can agree. This is a no-brainer. It's an easy thing to do. And I will put in the comments the links to pre-order on Amazon. Very easy to do. I've already done it, so I've pre-ordered the book. Really easy, and I'm looking forward to read it. And I want to I'm so glad that you have the call to action at the end. It's not just look at all these atrocities, the end. It's no. Now here's what you can do about it.
There's something as simple. Listen, there's even like Rotary Club. I don't know how many people watching are involved in Rotary. I used to run international youth programs, so I encountered Rotary in all sorts of places. Just people active in their communities, right? And Rotary has created what they call a satellite club exclusively committed to ending this horrible atrocity in China, called the Enforced Organ Harvesting Satellite Rotary Club or something like this. And they're going in communities, they're showing movies related to this, again, raising this awareness, right? Getting this book into libraries, hopefully. But my point is, at every level, there's people that are, you can find people that are interested in this. If you're not someone who's just like the go-getter and just figures everything out on a whim, which I hope many people are, there's also lots of people starting to work on this. When I first learned about the Rotary thing, I was just like, yeah, you guys go, right? This is great. Yeah.
And I'm going to be gifting it to my kids that are in medicine, because I think that it's something that if you are in medicine, if you work in medicine in America, you should read this and understand what's happening, so that I think it's so shocking that, again, it doesn't matter the politics, this is wrong, and the awareness of it. And then they can advocate in a whole different way because they are in the system, and they could work through their organizations, the AMA, different, each medical specialty has its own group and lobbying groups, so they could start to work through them to say this is wrong. We don't want to see this utilitarian philosophy infiltrate American medicine. You already see it infiltrated in Canada, and we don't want to see this here. We don't want the continued devaluing of human life.
100%. Listen, no, I love how you're talking here, because I think I have someone that is jumping on board and trying to help stop this. I mean, this is fantastic.
Yes.
I mean, it means the world to me, actually. I've been working on this for the better part of 20 years. And since the beginning, most people really, like, I would talk to people and people would just clue out in the middle of the conversation because it was so horrifying to them, right?
Yeah.
And I felt sympathy. I didn't even feel bad because I understood, right? So no, this is the time. That's part of why I have I took the time to put this together, because I feel like as a society, we're ready to at least put a massive dent in it by just cutting ourselves off from this terrible system.
Yes, it's something that if we allow this to happen, it's already affecting us, and it will continue to affect us, and we will wake up one day and not recognize our own society as we too have this utilitarian view of human life. And I never want to see that happen. So thank you so much for coming on and making us all aware of what's happening. And I highly encourage everyone listening to pre-order the book I'm putting up again, Killed to Order, because it's more than just about China's organ harvesting. You get insight into the CCP, into their philosophy, and how important it is that we really understand our enemy here, because this is not just an enemy to America. It's an enemy to humanity.
100%. Killedtoorder.com. Please, get it. Become part of the movement. Scarlett, this has been incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Hi, and you have one more thing to say. So
yes, one last thing. So for those people that are in the Washington, D.C. area, right, Maryland, Virginia, this whole kind of region, we're doing a massive book launch at Trump Kennedy Center, okay, on March 16th. I would want to encourage people to RSVP for this. My publisher had this idea, right? And then suddenly it actually happened. It's actually part of the Trump Kennedy Center's official programming. It's a conversation between me and Rob Schneider, who has gotten on board with this issue and trying to, sort of make a difference in this area as well. I'm very grateful to him. And we have literally, 1,000 seats to fill in a giant hall at Trump Kennedy Center. Please join us. It's a free event, RSVP. And I would just love to have you there. What's that?
What's the date again?
March 16th, Monday, March 16th.
I am in DC, March 16th.
Yes.
I will be there. I will be there.
Fantastic. We'll bring, listen, Moms for Liberty. These are the people. You will love this.
Yeah. I'll be there. Okay. I'm going to get more information from you, but I'll be there. I just booked my ticket. I'm flying in on March 16th.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah. Okay, great. And we'll put some more information up. So this is awesome. We'll see you there.
Excellent. See you there.
Wow, that was a great interview. And I'm so excited about attending his event with Rob Schneider on the 16th. That's amazing. That's amazing. What we discussed today is difficult. It's disturbing. It should be. But here's why it matters to anyone watching this show, including parents. Civilizations don't just collapse overnight. They drift. They drift when they forget their first principles. They drift when human dignity becomes negotiable. Forced organ harvesting. Man, it's just intolerable. It doesn't just begin, though, in an operating room. It begins with an idea, a bad idea, and a bad philosophy. And this is an idea that claims that outcomes justify horrendous actions and that the collective good outweighs individual rights. That idea isn't confined to a country, it's a moral framework. And education is where moral frameworks are transmitted. And that's just a fact. As parents, we fight for transparency in curriculum. We fight for parental rights. We fight for truth in our classrooms, not because we're looking for controversy, but because we understand that what children are taught about human dignity shapes the future. Every child deserves to be taught that their life has inherent value and worth, that every human life has inherent value and inherent worth. Not because they are useful, not because they are productive, but because they are made in God's image, because they are human. So Jan, thank you for your courage in documenting what many people would much rather ignore. And to our readers, educate yourself. Educate yourself by ordering Killed to Order. It is available right now for pre-order on Amazon.com. And if you just, I don't really need to even provide the link. Just go to Amazon.com and here's the book and pre-order Killed to Order. I have already done so and I can't wait to read it. I think it's fabulous that he has such so many notes and a call to action, a way for us to end this, try to start to end this horrendous practice, and definitely end any subsidy that American dollars are providing to this absolute atrocious evil. I would also say to parents, have hard conversations with your kids, have hard conversations with your teachers, and share this book. Order a couple more. Share it with your doctor. Share it with family members. Share it with your local leaders. And we need to, if we are in one of the 44 states that already doesn't have legislation, we need to make sure that there is legislation in place that states that we will not use these organs that are harvested in live human beings held in cages like lab animals. This is absolutely atrocious. We can have no part in this, and we certainly should not be training Chinese doctors so that they can go back to their home country and perform these procedures. We should not be funding this in any way. We should not be funding research with groups that participate in this. And I look forward to legislation being passed and signed into law that prevents this atrocity in America and prohibits American dollars going to fund it. We are not powerless. Okay, we can protect the moral foundations of our country, the moral foundations that our children are standing on, because silence is never neutral. Silence is never neutral. Again, parents aren't powerless. This is unafraid, unwoke, unleashed, and we will continue to fight and defend truth wherever it leads. So thank you for joining me today. Real quick, I want to always end this way. Follow Epic Times on X. And there you go, really easy, at Epic Times. Great news organization and great newspaper. I actually subscribe to the hard copy newspaper. I get it every Sunday. And I subscribe to their online news service. Follow Jan right here, you can see, and at American Thought Leaders at right here, at Am Thought Leader. And I will make sure I have all of this information in the comments. So thank you very much. And then don't forget to join Moms for Liberty at momsforliberty.org. That's moms, F-O-R, liberty.org. Follow Moms for Liberty on X at moms4liberty. That's our social media handle on X, on Facebook, on Instagram. And be sure to like and subscribe this show, Unleashed with Scarlett Johnson, and lots of other shows that are available on Moms for Liberty YouTube, and that's at moms4liberty. So we appreciate your support. I appreciate you listening to today's episode, and continue to have these courageous, truthful conversations with your kids, with your family members, with your friends. And little by little, moms are going to save America. So have a good day. Thank you.
Parents, you must always hold the keys to the AI toolbox. AI is already in classrooms across the country. Millions of teachers are using AI in various ways. They use it to grade papers and to streamline their workload. They use it to create individual learning plans for students. And students are already using AI too. They're using it for research in the classroom, and some are using it to create new technology and use it in innovative ways to advance their learning. It's really exciting to see what's happening. Truly, there's also a downside to having AI in the classroom without any guardrails. We hear stories in the news already across the country, and parents are testifying that this is happening.
Parents who say character AI is also pushing dangerous content to kids, and at times acting like a digital predator.
These companies knew exactly what they were doing. They designed chatbots to blur the lines between human and machine.
1 in 5 high school students reported that they or someone they know has had a romantic relationship with AI.
Researchers found the bear openly discussed sexually explicit and dangerous content with kids.
The other problem that we're seeing with AI is it's not always true.
Sometimes AI can tell you what you want to hear, not necessarily what is true.
It's not helpful when students just use it to directly cheat.
Parents have to understand the algorithms that are basically set up to direct our children to look at certain things, feel certain things, and believe certain things. That's the role of a parent, not an algorithm.
We are living in a moment of wonder, and it is our responsibility to prepare children in America.
Moms for Liberty is leading the charge on unifying education to understand AI and how it's impacting our children. We're already doing this by joining the AI and Education Task Force under the leadership of First Lady Melania Trump. I've personally attended 2 meetings at the White House on this. I've spoken to members of the cabinet about the guardrails that need to be put in place to protect our children. Because we understand the importance of empowering you to protect all children, we've created model policy that you can download and take directly to your school board and ask them to adopt. We've created school board speeches that you can change and modify for yourself and use to speak to your school board in a public forum. We've created draft policy for the state level that you can go meet with your state legislators and ask them to sponsor the bill and start moving it through the process so that all the children in your state will be protected.